Hi, Suzanne from Flatwearable Artisan Jewelry. In this tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to make a cuff bracelet out of two handles. This is going to be a silver plated project. This requires a high melt temp solder, and we're going to be using medium solder, and we're also going to be using an optional easy solder for an optional part of the project. So this is one I have made before, and it has a little brace on the back. And the reason I put the brace on is because this handle is very, very thin. So to give some additional support to the seam area, I added a brace. If you have a thick pieces of silverware, you may not need to add a brace, but you can also add a brace that has your maker's mark or your stamp on it, and that's what we're going to do in this project here. Is I'm going to add this little disc that's got Flatwearable Artisan Jewelry on it as my maker's mark, and I have the same flatware that was used in this bracelet, but this was used with a demi spoons, and this is a fork. So we have some heavier material to work with here, but I'm still going to add a brace because it gets pretty thin here at the tip. And we're just going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm going to be using these two pieces of silverware here, and like I mentioned, it gets pretty thin here at the end. So I am going to add a brace on the back side. And the first thing you want to do is you want to get these more squared off. You want to have more surface area for your pieces to attach to. So if you tried to do one where it just ended like that, you're not going to get a very good connection. You really just don't have enough material there to make a strong enough connection for a cuff bracelet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to square off these ends down here. I'm just going to grind off these tips with my vertical belt sander, which also has a rotary disc on the side. So I'm just going to smooth those off there. I'm also going to make sure that the ends are nice and flush and even by putting them into the miter jig and making sure they are exactly perfect. All right, I have ground off the ends here on these pieces, so I have a nice flush connection. In addition to grinding them off, I also filed the edges smooth on the miter vise. If you're not familiar with how to use a miter vise, we just did a video where I show how to use the miter vise, and that is going to ensure that you're going to get a perfect fit with these pieces. As I've said before, solder does not effectively fill gaps, so you want to have as perfect of a seam as possible. So since we're working with silver plate and we're also going to be soldering with medium jeweler solder, we need to protect the plating, and with that, by doing that, we're going to ensure that the high heat that we are applying here is not going to damage the silver plating. So anywhere you need it protected, you need to paint Fire Shield on. Fire Shield's a product we carry on our website. Really, it's a super product. Not only is going to protect the silver plating, but additionally to that, anywhere that you do not want solder to flow, you want to put on the Fire Shield. So let me make sure this is all nice and clean. I'm going to use some 000 steel wool just to make sure this is all clean. Solder does not like dirty surfaces and will not adhere to dirty surfaces. So if you have solder that's balling up and doesn't flow, it's usually one of two things. It's either you have dirty surfaces, or it is you don't have the piece hot enough. So I am painting on a thin coating, and this needs to be painted on everywhere. Just because we're not going to be heating, or we're not going to be soldering these other areas, it's going to get heated. to a very high temperature, and that will potentially damage the silver plating. So I am putting this everywhere except for my seam area. You want to be careful that you're doing it correctly without getting any fire shield on that seam area. If you do, it's just not going to work, not going to hold. It's not going to melt, actually. So I'm putting that on my honeycomb board. Got a T-pin on either end, and that's to hold the pieces together so they don't migrate away from each other. I think sometimes one of the trickiest parts of soldering is finding ways to support your pieces so that you can solder. We're doing this before we bend the bracelet. That's going to make it a lot easier than if you bend your pieces and then try to solder them together. So, alright, so I've got the fire shield painted on there. I'm putting the pieces on my honeycomb board, and I'm butting up the edges that we're going to be soldering. I've got a T-pin on either end, and that'll help keep the pieces from migrating once they are heated. Okay, so you can see I've got a nice join there. No gaps. No gaps is really important. Okay, we're going to be using medium jeweler solder. We're also going to be using Mighty Flux. And let me get my snippies here. I'm going to cut 3 small pallions. I'm actually going to cut a few more because very frequently pieces go flying or get lost or what have you. So always cut a few more than you need. And sometimes you just need to add a little bit more. One of the things that I always say about soldering is people use too much solder for the most part. So as much solder as you think you need, back off because you probably don't need that much. Alright, I'm going to dry the fire shield up first because I'm going to be spraying Mighty Flux on. And I don't want the Mighty Flux wetting the fire shield and then moving into the seam that I'm working on. So I've got my Mighty Flux in a little peroxide bottle here. I've fluxed that area, okay? Preheat that area. Now I'm going to set my solder chips on. Turn my flame off. I'm going to set my solder chips on, and I will show you how much solder I'm using. I'm going to go across the seam, kind of at an angle here. And one more. By putting the flux on first and warming that area up, your pallions of solder aren't gonna go flying all over the place. Make sure that you spend the time to get this just right. Mine has moved a little bit, so I'm going to try and move it back. Okay. Setup is really, really, really important. I'm trying to think of things to tell you that have been learning experiences for me. And one of the things that I have found to be a good learning experience is make sure you're set up properly to start with. Because if you're not, you're generally going to have some problems somewhere along the way. You just don't want to stay. You can use Handy Flux here as well. Doesn't really matter. Okay, just going to put just a dab more flux on there because my pieces, my little pieces of solder want to keep moving. Alright, so I'm going to gently heat the entire piece. I'm not even going to focus on the area that we're soldering at this point. because we've got a lot of area to heat here. If you just heat the area that you're trying to solder, you're going to find that it's most likely going to ball up on you, and you need to heat the whole area, the whole piece. This is a big piece, and these areas out in here are thicker, so it's going to take quite a bit of heat here to get this completely warmed up. I'm going to grab my solder pick. Always have your solder pick handy. And I'm getting flow here. My pieces wanted to pop up. My pieces want to pop up there. So now we're just heating that area. You can see, hopefully, you can see that the solder has balled up, but it has not flowed, and that is because the heat is being drawn away, because it's a large piece. So we just need to make sure our heat is evenly distributed around here. Once the piece heats up to temperature, the solder will flow. Keep your solder pick handy. Alright, we've got flow. I'm going to spread that around. Now, I would suggest turning off your flame. And I'm going to flip this piece over, and I'm going to make sure I've got solder flow all the way through to the other side. And it looks like I do. But what I'm going to do to ensure that I have the solder flowed all the way through is I'm going to add just a dab more of solder. So I added my flux. I'm going to put my chips down, my pallions of solder. I'm going to use 2. And the piece is already pretty hot, so it shouldn't take too long to flow the second bunch. Keep your solder pick handy, as we're going to spread that solder out. The bigger your piece is, the more heat is going to be required. You can do this with a butane torch. It's going to take a while, especially with pieces that are this large. So if you feel like it's taken forever, it's probably because the level of heat you're using just isn't sufficient. Move up to a plumber's torch. Nap gas is pretty darn hot. Alright, so we've got solder flow. Solder flows in the direction of heat, so if you need the solder to come out to the edges, put your flame at the edges. Okay, we've got good solder flow there. So we're going to need to always quench your solder pick. I have touched myself with a solder pick a few too many times. You kind of learn after a while. Quench the solder pick immediately. Okay, so I'm going to show this to you. This is blazing hot, but I'm going to show you the soldering here. Okay, that is the front. That is the back. I don't have a lot of solder slop. That's fabulous. One of the things you can do to cool this down faster is you don't want to quench this immediately. You want to let it cool down. You do not want to break the seam. So if you lay it on a steel bench block, that helps draw the heat out a lot faster than you can quench. All right. I'm going to quench this, and we'll be back. Okay, I have quenched that. I've got fire shield on there, so I'm going to get that scrubbed up. I'm going to use some Dawn dish soap and a toothbrush. I'm going to scrub that up, get that all cleaned up, and then we'll be back to do the next step. All right, so I got the piece all cleaned up and it is ready to add our little brace back plate. I've gone ahead, got everything cleaned up. We're ready to roll on that. I've added the fire shield again. First thing we need to do is we need to add solder to the back of our brace. And in this case, like I said, mine is going to be my maker's mark. So we're going to be using easy solder. And the reason for that is when you do subsequent solderings, you need to go down in levels of solder so you don't accidentally damage or break the seam you've just worked on. So I'm going to cut myself a couple of pieces of easy solder, get those ready, and I put flux on the back of my disc. I'm going to heat my disc, burn the flux. I'm going to add my chips of easy solder, and I'm going to heat. And then you're going to want to spread around that solder so it goes to the edges. This is a really thin piece, so you've got to be careful not to accidentally melt it. This is a piece of sterling. If you wanted to use something from a silver-plated tray, you wanted to punch out a disc from a silver-plated tray or cut out a brace from a silver-plated tray, you can do that as well. All right, I just cut this disc out with a circle disc cutter, like that. Okay, so now I'm going to, before I do any soldering, I am going to dry up the fire shield on my piece. I'm going to spray my Mighty Flux on. I'm going to dry that. Now I'm going to add my piece onto the back. And if you can see in the video, it kind of pops up a little on either side. We're going to coax that down with our solder pick. The disc is going to become very malleable and very soft, so we'll be able to get that to lay down. All right, got to be gentle with your heat when you're working with these little thin pieces. You don't want to just lay the heat right on there. Okay, now we're going to give some heat to the disc. Just a little heat at a time. Don't keep your flame directly on that. We need the base to heat up sufficiently. That's going to take a lot longer than the disc itself. There's a saying in soldering, if it's not glowing, it ain't flowing, which means if your metal isn't red hot, your solder isn't going to flow. The disc is getting nice and red hot. We're getting there. You also have to make sure you're not going to overheat past the temperature that's going to flow for the disc, or you're going to break your medium solder seam. Right, I'm getting there. Use a tweezer, push that down. There it goes. I was able to push that down. Okay, so same thing. We're going to let that cool a little bit. We're going to quench it, clean it up, and I'll be back with the next step. Okay, I've got this piece. I'm working on cleaning it up. Fire shield can be a pain to remove, so I have found my brass brushes to be invaluable. Invaluable for a number of reasons, but they definitely help. So I've used the handheld brass brush. Now I'm going back in with the one on my rotary, because this one can really get right down in the pattern there. I absolutely love these brass brushes. I use them for everything. So we're to the point where we need to clean everything up and get it ready to bend into shape. I would suggest when you're learning how to do this, you may want to give a little flex to your piece after you've done with the soldering, because if it's going to break, it's best that it breaks before you go to finish it, so you can go ahead and fix it. This is going to take you some time and some practice. All right, here we are. So I'm going to do a final polish after it's bent. Maybe I'll do it beforehand. Probably just going to go to my bench buffer, use some white compound followed by some red compound. Get that all shined up, and then we're going to bend. Okay, we are going to bend the piece now. Now, as I suggested, I would give it a little bit of a flex to start with. Make sure that it's going to hold. Make sure you did your soldering properly. It's a lot easier to go back in and solder it now while it's flat, as opposed to getting a couple of the ends bent and then having it snap. So I'm going to start by giving a gentle curve to it with the roller on the rubber block. We're really focusing on curling the ends, not so much the middle. That's also going to help you to not accidentally break your solder seam. But I've always said, I'd rather have, as much as disappointing as it is, I'd much rather have a piece break while I'm working on it than have it break in a customer's hands. So if it's going to break, allow it to break now rather than while a customer is handling it. Okay, so a little more of a bend right there. I'm going just about half an inch away from the solder seam. Okay, now I'm starting to push it around. This piece is flexible enough to push it around. I'm not ready to put it in the cradle just yet. I want to try and get a nice curve going on the rubber block. And I'm just showing you this way because you're less likely to break the solder seam if you do it gently. But like I said, you also want, if it's going to break, you want it to break now. So, alright, I'm about there. Not too far from being finished there. So now I'm going to use the cradle forming block. And I'm going to go back in, give it a little tweak there on the end, check it, I'm going to tweak that again. Okay, got a nice curve there, same thing on the opposite side. Check it again. We're just about there. You can make it round, you can make it oval, whatever your desired shape is. if you leave it a little bit flatter on the top to create more of an oval shape, I think you will have a more pleasing look. Some wrists are more round, some are more oval. I'm creating this for a more oval wrist. Okay, just want to look at that a little bit. Maybe tweak it a little by hand. And I think one more press in that area should do it. All right, let's see what we have here. And here we are with the finished piece. Okay, that is the bend that I created. Now that's more oval. If you decide that you want yours round, you know, it's your project, your work. Do it however you are most comfortable and what pleases your eye the most. Okay. And on the inside, we've accomplished a couple of things. One is we've created a brace to help hold pieces that are really, really thin like that. And I've also left my maker's mark in there. And one other benefit is if you do have a sloppy solder seam, you've just covered it all up. All right. If you have any questions, be sure to ask and I'll be glad to answer them. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.